the fundamental reality, there are no boundaries. Things are always interconnected. And therefore, they cannot be described as something which is closed. Impossible. The non-understanding of quantum physics is not an intellectual problem, it's a psychological problem. Can I drink my coffee before we start, or?
Yes, yes, we agree.
How you doing, Bernardo?
I'm doing great. And you, sir?
I'm okay. I'm almost done with your with part 2.
Oh, okay. We are really looking forward.
I'm just, oof.
Just first of all, Federico, just huge gratitude for you making the time to be here with us and presenting your ideas. And so, yeah, please take it away when you're ready. If you want to give us a
that's
your thinking.
Yes. Well, my background is an Italian born in Vicenza near Venice, graduated in physics, and turned into a materialist by the study of physics. Materialism was, at least it could explain how things work, and religions couldn't. So, I felt that whatever initial spiritual movement that was in me was, was somewhat not that important, because it was stopped there, so to speak. It would not lead me to any better understanding of myself or the world. So I embrace materialism, and my first, the first part of my life was as an inventor and an entrepreneur and engineer, and this takes me to my third company, Synaptics, where I was developing neural networks in '86, early second part of the '80s, and I was studying neuroscience and biology, and was trying to understand how the brain works. And I thought the brain was not a computer, really. I mean, it was clearly an information processing structure, but completely different than a computer. I had studied enough biology to understand that much, and but still an information processing device. So if that was so, then and if consciousness was like the people were saying, the scientists were saying, an epiphenomenon or the functioning of the brain, well, then a computer should be conscious as well. And on my spare time, I was trying to figure that out because I was interested. And at that time, I was also not particularly happy with my life. Actually, I was very unhappy with my life, even though I didn't know why, having achieved everything that the world says that if you do, you should be happy. And so that was a problem of consciousness, obviously, though at that time that was not clear. And it was in that milieu that I had an extraordinary experience of consciousness that revealed to me that reality is not what I thought. And I experienced myself as the world that observed itself with my own perspective, with my own point of view. So essentially, I was a manifestation of the world that could see itself as a point of view of itself, which is kind of crazy in a way, but having studied quantum physics, that was not any more crazy than quantum physics. And it was a revelation, because that was an experience. It was not a thought. It was not a reflection. It was not having read something. It had the power. For the first time, it had the power of self-evidence that can only come from that type of experience, a direct knowing experience that comes from consciousness. That shocked me so much that my life really was changed. And for a period of 20 years, I went through an exploration of consciousness through meditations, various forms of psychological and spiritual exercises and so on. And through that process, I had many others extraordinary experiences of consciousness, similar to the first one, that gave where you actually understand things that can only be understood by experiencing them, which is the essence of what consciousness is. When we read a book, we simply we can comprehend what we already sort of know, or close to what we already know. But if you could not have an understanding, a comprehension. I use the word comprehension for this type of understanding. The comprehension that comes from consciousness, if unless you have this direct knowing that comes from seeing reality much closer to what it is, instead of seeing it through the filter of the body that with this sensory brain system transforms whatever is here into a representation of whatever is here, which is not even close to what is here. That much already physics is telling us, but it is even beyond that. It goes beyond that. 20 years of this type of work that gave me a sense of what consciousness is, led me to a conclusion, tentative conclusion. I'm a scientist, so I don't have final conclusions, but a tentative conclusion that consciousness must be fundamental. Consciousness and free will goes necessarily with consciousness once consciousness is self-aware of itself. If I know that I have an experience and I can direct that experience, I need free will to direct that experience. And consciousness and free will, I say something that I will explain more later, are non-algorithmic properties of reality. In other words, there is no algorithm, no mathematical formula, no possible prediction that can be made of what will be the future, where a deterministic system, like a classical system, the next state is determined entirely by the previous one. So you have essentially, a total absence of free will, and therefore consciousness doesn't make any sense. Even if it existed, is a sort of it's an epiphenomenon in some way, because it cannot change the direction of the future, and especially the future of a self, of what I call a sati right now. Sati is selfhood, some entity that has three aspects, from the fundamental aspect. This identity, which is the understanding that the experience that you are having is your own experience, and therefore you can control it with your free will. So that type of sense of self that allow you to be an agent that can do things that are not determined by any prior, by any algorithm, by any prior arrangement, mathematical or not, but simply your will. In other words, the future state cannot be determined, cannot be known ahead of the free will decision and consciousness. So a sati that has identity, a sati is an entity that has identity, that has agency, free will agency, and has consciousness, self-consciousness, the capacity to know that it is experiencing itself and the world through that identity. So I've been decided that that consciousness had to be, and free will had to be fundamental. I realized that the narrative of physics, the narrative of science as to how the universe evolved, cannot be the way physics is telling us, because according to science, consciousness is born with the brain, is an epiphenomenon of the brain. In fact, it would require a brain to exist. A cell could not be conscious because there is no brain in a cell. And if you look at, a protozoan behaves exactly like a little fish, even without a brain. And so, for me, that kind of idea that you need a brain in order to be conscious, that didn't make any sense, because we are made of cells which have all those capacities. And so if consciousness exists, it has to also exist at all levels of life, and in fact, all levels of known life. What we call known life is expressions of some kind of entities that for the moment we don't understand. So I decided to start a foundation for this scientific study of consciousness, because that was the only way that I could contribute also financially to an endeavor that I think is essential, which is understanding what makes us human, what distinguishes us from artificial intelligence, from robots, and understanding deeply the nature of reality. Because if consciousness comes first, as I'm saying, and free will comes first, then obviously consciousness and free will had a fundamental hand to the evolution of the universe, that now is attributed to the operation of laws. So laws cannot be what we think they are. They have to be something that evolve also. They have to be something akin to rules of language, like syntactical rules of language, as opposed to firm laws that are there from the very beginning, that represent a sort of miracle, because how can the world be determined by laws and they have free will? I mean, it makes no sense unless the laws are really syntactical laws, which is the laws with which we express meaning, and in which the symbols of these laws have to be probabilistic, exactly like quantum physics. So that took me to a point where I had a theory, a model more than a theory, that says that in order to have a world that evolve in a way similar to what science is describing, the Big Bang theory is describing, that evolution of reality has to be the result not of chance or randomness, but the result of something deeper, an understanding of the world, an understanding that the world has of itself through the evolution in which the complexification that we see is really a representation of the ever deeper meaning that the universe recognizes within itself. And so if we start this way, all of a sudden, you begin to see that the fundamental aspect of reality must be entities that are like seities, conscious entities, that emerge from one, the totality of what exists, that interacting with each other can know themselves, and thus one know itself. And so that's one of the tenet of my way of understanding consciousness right now. And then the next thing is that reality must be made of something, clearly not a substance in the sense of a matter, but some sort of something that can self-reflect, and that in that self-reflection know itself, but also be able to communicate with aspects of itself, which are these seities, that allow this substance to know itself through its many and different reflections of itself. In other words, when one knows itself for the first time, it brings into existence what it knows. which is exactly what consciousness does. A direct conscious experience brings into existence what it experiences. So it has created a conscious entity in that self-cognition. And that entity then has to reflect itself, has to have contain the essence of one within itself, because one being holistic, when it sees itself, it has to see all of itself, because it's not made of separable parts. It cannot see a part of itself. So the only thing that, the reason why there are many is because one, every time it sees itself, it knows itself in a certain way, it creates an entity that is an emanation, is like almost a copy, almost a sun, a copy of itself that has the capacity then to do exactly what one does, which is to know itself in turn. But because now there are many, that those selves, those seities, see, interact, they see the others, and they want to know the others, and to know the others, they must communicate. So they must create symbols to communicate, because to communicate requires symbols. And so the symbols are then the analog, or they are the correlate, if you want, of an experience, where the experience produces a meaning within the seities, like the meaning that we have within ourselves. And the symbols are simply the representation of a meaning. So the last chapter of this adventure is happened the last few years, where with a collaborator, which is one of the top 10 experts in quantum information in the world, Giacomo Mauro Dariano, is a professor of theoretical physics at University of Pavia, that showed that quantum physics derives entirely from quantum information through 6 postulates that are purely informational. So quantum physics has no ontology whatsoever, is simply an abstract aspect of quantum information, which is itself abstract. And this theory called OPT, operational probabilistic theory, was what I was looking for, because in my model, this self-reflecting substance had to have 2 fundamental aspects. One was an informational aspect, which is the communication aspect, the symbolic aspect, and the other had to be the semantic aspect, the meaning, the knowing of itself that these entities wants to achieve. And so through this communication, then entities can know each other ever more. They can combine and create the various hierarchies of entities. They are reflected in the hierarchies of matter that we see. Our body, for example, is a hierarchy of particle, atoms, molecules, macromolecules, and so on, which are coherent within each other, a form of coherence that does not exist in the classical computer, and therefore they represent one of these symbols that I call live symbols, because they have the characteristics of coherent quantum systems, but expressed, however, in space and time, where the quantum information cannot be expressed in space-time, can only be described in Hilbert spaces. Hilbert spaces are complex spaces, n-dimensional complex spaces. I don't want to get there, because that would take days just to explain that. But Hilbert spaces are the spaces in which quantum information exists. And with Dariano, we have come to a theory that says that a quantum system, which is in a quantum state, in a pure quantum state, is a very specific type of quantum state, has the experience of its own state. So with this simple connection, we now have seen that quantum information has the same characteristics of inner experience, because it is definite, It is very precise. It cannot be anything but itself. And it is very, and we know it, even if we don't know it completely, we know it. And then it has the characteristic that it is private. In other words, my experience is only mine, and no one can actually know what I'm experiencing. I can only, if I want to express what I'm experiencing, even myself, I cannot express it completely. I have to use symbols which are much more limited. They're classical symbols, shareable symbols, like the bits of the computers, versus the quantum information, which is non-clonable, non-reproducible, which is a fundamental property of quantum information. So here we see that the phenomenology of experience is the same as the phenomenology of quantum information. So quantum information then, instead of describing the outer world, the world of physics, describes the inner world of experience. And this is an unbelievable connection, because it changes completely our concept of the world. The world has two aspects. It's made of information. The world is made of information in the sense that the quantum world expresses information which is non-reproducible, therefore therefore knowable only from the inside. And the classical information is the information that is shareable, like the bits of the computers can be copied, and therefore that information is what the conscious entities need to communicate with each other. And of course, when they do so, there is a theorem in quantum physics that says that if you measure a quantum system in a quantum state, you can only get at most 1 bit per quantum bit of the quantum state. And a quantum bit is an infinity of states. So you go from an infinity of possibilities into a number of bits of possibilities, which are a very small number. So we have the experience described by quantum information, don't describe, represented by quantum information, because if we were described, it would be a copy. Represented by quantum information has a inner self-knowing, an inner capacity of expression that is infinitely more than what can be expressed outside, which is also exactly what we experience. The love that I feel for my children doesn't matter how many symbols I use to express it, I would always leave something out in my expression. I stop here because otherwise I keep on going, and it's a soliloquy.
Well, it's a pleasure if you do decide to keep on going. But maybe just to drop a question. Do your conclusions around purpose and free will and consciousness, would you say they've stemmed more from your personal, we could almost call them spiritual experiences, the ones that you've mentioned that were big openings up, or were they more from a philosophical or scientific conclusions?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I was looking at how to connect and explain my experiences based on what science knows. And I got very, very close, actually, intuitively, simply by logically reasoning on what I experienced, because the data is in the experience. It cannot be some imagination, some sort of random imagination. It has to be, or what other people say, because if you don't understand, how can you can only understand if you have an experience which is similar to what is described with classical symbols. But the classical symbols cannot describe something that cannot express something that you don't already know, almost know. That there is a little step that perhaps you can do with intuition, but they can only get you so far, the symbols. And if you haven't got a similar experience, you will never be able to understand. And but by the way, this is very simple. Suppose you have never tasted any chocolate, and nothing even close to the taste of chocolate. And I can give you an article that describes very well, by my standard, because I had tasted chocolate, describe very well the taste of chocolate. You read the article, and it's impossible for you to actually reproduce the actual taste of chocolate. I give you a little piece of chocolate, and 10 seconds later, you say, wow, what a great description you did in that article about this, the taste of chocolate, where before you didn't understand. I mean, it was nice. They were good words, nice words, but they didn't hit the spot, because this spot is hit by the comprehension that only consciousness can give you. And so if you don't have, if I didn't have those experiences, I could not reason, because how do you reason? You reason by having something that you kind of understand, and you need to kind of explain them how they work together, because there is some inner logic in reality. One has to be self-coherent. Cannot be, cannot be incoherence. If it was incoherent, it couldn't even exist. So the coherence of one requires that there be structure in the meaning and structure in the symbols that express the meaning. And so I arrived very close to what quantum physics was saying. I never studied quantum information. Dariano is an expert in quantum information. It took me many years to kind of express to him what I meant, what my experiences were telling me, and it was, and so I had put the ball next to the hole in the golf, and Dariano it put the ball the ball into the hole, because he knew that quantum information was non-clonable. And he had all the characteristics of experience, because I expressed it to him, he finally understood it, and so on. But so together we basically came to this theory, which is so simple and is so compelling when you think about it, because it completely changes from this to this the actual narrative of physics. Is telling you the quantum information is actually describing the interiority of the universe, because it has the characteristics of the experience that the universe has of itself. And it's the only way. What does it mean that information cannot be reproducible? It doesn't make any sense. That's why people don't understand quantum physics, because they are trying to make sense of something that does not make sense unless it points to something that you and everybody else has, which is experience. The fact that our experience has the same characteristics of quantum information.
Beautiful. And to what extent do you intuit that other scientists and other people will be able to follow along with your theory, given that many of them might not have tasted chocolate in the way that you have?
Yeah, but that's the problem, that you have to you convince people by simply being open to have an experience. If I am successful in with my logic and the way I express myself, because there has to be something beyond logic, something that connects me, my being, with another being, even if we don't understand what it is, but this sort of empathy, they see that I cannot lie, I cannot make it up. There's got to be something real there. So they are convinced that I'm not just making things up for whatever purpose, but that there's something there real in the logic of what I'm saying. There is something very powerful, and then they open themselves up. Then they can have those experiences. Like I didn't make up my experience. My first awakening experience came because I wanted to know, and I wanted to know only because I wanted to know, just for the knowing of it, not because I want to make something out of it. And it was in that sort of spirit that whoever is the vaster self that I am, gave me that experience, allow me to see with the eyes which are, which are deeper than the eyes of the body, that can only see what's the symbolic aspect of this reality through the body and through the brain that transforms the signals that come from this vaster world. So you cannot, if a person simply brushes off whatever you say because is not aligned with the theory that one has, which is the typical reaction of a scientist to say, wow, this you go against this theory, therefore you're wrong. But you see, the theory of reality is not reality. And this is one of the problems that I realized that I had myself, that I had assumed that the theory of reality, the physics that I knew, was reality. But reality is substantially vaster than what I had known up to that point. And the moment that I had this gift, this experience, then I realized that, my God, then whatever was the theory of reality, that theory of reality can only explain a little bit of reality, but certainly not all of reality.
And I'll bring Bernardo in a second, but just one last question, because if I've understood you, you're inviting the possibility that this framework opens people up to an availability of the experience of,
explaining this framework in the way that I'm explaining, in which it connects physics, it connects the theory, and actually explains a theory that is incomprehensible otherwise. To people that are open to understand, they will invite them to want to understand. And if you want to understand, the world will show you what you want to understand. Because it did that to me. But you had to work at it. You cannot just, give it to me, You had to work at it. But that's...
And can you say a couple more ththings about the working on it? What, in your case, was that meditation, or was it philosophy?
I started with meditation, and I found people that were, had done, had been there before, and to teach me, and on it goes. But ultimately, it never was the symbolic aspect of reality that made me advance. My advancement was only due to my extraordinary experiences, because those are the ones that give me the real data. And I see it from the inside. I know what it feels, and I know how it connects with something else that I felt in another experience that was extraordinary. And so you begin to put together the pieces based on the experience, but just like we have done with physics. We do experiments outside, and we try to understand them using logic. And then you finally find that some mathematics are actually, wow, is actually reflecting that behavior, the behavior that you have seen, the physical behavior that you've seen. And in this case, the behavior is inner. It's still the same principle, the principle that ultimately it cannot be a dogmatic system that brings men forward, but it has to be a logical, experiential method, but that, however, does not deny that the inner experience is unreal, which is what physics today is saying. It's basically saying all that happens, consciousness and free will are epiphenomenal, means you think that they're real, but they're not real. So reality is just playing games with you when you actually think something is real, but no, we know better than you. I'll tell you, it's not real, guys. I know what's real. Now, it doesn't mean that because I know what's real that I understand it. To understand it takes unraveling, takes effort. It cannot be done just because that's another problem with some people that have an experience and they claim that they can explain it. Not explaining something is not the same that as having had the experience. So explaining it you have to bring together all the pieces and create a holistic system, something that makes sense, that is not illogical, that is not contradictory. And that's what science does. And it does it well. But it does it well having eliminated a priori consciousness and free will. Because scientists started to try to explain the sensible world, the physical world. And they found themselves they were explaining more than they expected. But now they cannot explain everything. We know that science cannot explain what consciousness is, and they cannot explain free will. It seems contradictory to having laws. And so we cannot eliminate the interiority, which is what gives meaning and purpose to us and to the universe. And so the idea that we can eliminate what we cannot explain, that's not science. And unfortunately, today we have many scientists that eliminate what they cannot explain.
Great. So a lot of what you've said will be resonating with things we've covered with Bernardo. And I'm just wondering, it might help me and potentially many others if you can highlight, Bernardo, how some of what's been covered correlates with the vocabulary we've been using. So I'm seeing a lot of overlap. For example, I'm imagining what you've called classical relates to things that are crossing a dissociative boundary. And if you want, Bernardo, feel free to take this into some dialogue with Federico as well. I don't know how much you've already compared your models in person and your vocabularies.
Okay, the first thing to say, when Federico says the quantum state is a description of the interiority of the world, I think this is like you're hitting the nail in the head. That's the critical point that is lost on us. Last week, I was in a conference on foundations of quantum mechanics that Essentia Foundation co-organized with the Institute of Quantum Optics and Quantum Information of Vienna, the home of Anton Zeilinger, who won the Nobel Prize this year. And we went through 8 presentations, and in nearly every one of them, the same paradox kept on coming back. And the paradox is the following. We know now, both theoretically and experimentally, that physical states are relational. They're not absolute. They are contextual. They depend on the context of measurement. But because we insist that the world as it is in itself, which Federico refers to as the interiority of the world, because we insist that that has to be made of physical states, classical physical states, we run into contradictions. We run into infinite regress, because then if the world as it is in itself is made of physical states, then all states of the world are relational. So you end up with relations amongst relations, and it's turtles or relations all the way down. And that kept on coming back. And the key realization that allows one to break free from this is to realize that quantum states refer to the interiority of the world, and classical physical states or classical physical quantities like the specific result of a measurement refer to appearance. And to understand that the world as it is in itself is made of states other than physical states after what goes by the name collapse, is key to making sense of physics today. And I think that is built right into Federico's worldview, in which he says, okay, the world as it is in itself, or the interiority of the world, is experiential. Therefore, it cannot be described through physical quantities. I mean, what is the length in centimeters of a thought? What is the weight in grams of an emotion? What is the angular momentum of a fantasy? You can't do that. But that's what the world is in and of itself, because beyond appearance, beyond representation, beyond measurement, what is left is interiority, and interiority is the noumenon. It's the thing in itself. So I'm right with Federico. I think all the way there may be some seeming points of deviation when Federico talks about free will, and people will have heard me saying that free will is a red herring, and Federico says no, free will is true, it exists. And if you dig below the surface, you will see that we are saying the same thing, but we make different assumptions regarding the starting point of our audiences. So we have different reference frames, so to say, but ultimately we are saying the same thing. When I say that free will is a red herring, what I mean is the ego, for it to have free will, it has to exist as an entity, but it's not there. And Federico covered this when he said in his seminal experience, he realized that he was the world. Now, that's not his ego, is the world. He's not a solipsist. his true self is the world, and that true self has free will, then yes, sure, it does, in the sense that if the true self is the world, then whatever the world does or chooses to do is determined by itself. And that is the very definition of free will. When an action is determined by the agent itself, that's free will. Now, when we get into analytic philosophy and how people use the word, then I would have to load it with all kinds of disclaimers. But the essence, the meaning that he's trying to get across, I subscribe, I would say 100% to it.
Great, and we'll open up this up to questions. So there's some beautiful questions coming through the chat and some prepared questions as well. But I know of great curiosity to many people, and there'll be some of these in the chat as well, is this idea, of course, around free will, but also around purpose. There's a beautiful passage in your book, Federico, about your intuition around the purpose being greater voluntary cooperation between entities, something like this, if I remember correctly. And with Bernardo, we've spoken at various lengths around whether there's meaning or purpose or direction, and creating distinctions between there being, let's say, direction to the universe, if I've understood correctly, Bernardo, which doesn't necessarily imply that there's a plan, that's been decided beforehand. Are you happy to speak to that a little bit, Federico, and just kind of cover the basics of your thinking around purpose, meaning, direction?
Yeah.
And sorry, I'll just add in one more thing to make it a very big question. How that might then, because again, this is a great curiosity for this audience, how that might then influence how we then decide to live. What implications that might have around how we live, if any. So I know that's a huge question, so take your time.
For me, the purpose of the universe, and therefore the purpose of life, and I will say a few words about what I think life is. So the purpose of life is, for one, the totality of what exists, of which we are part whole. So again, the concept that I will explain in a second. The purpose of life is for one to know itself. One wants to know itself. And in knowing itself, one brings into existence what he knows. And the existence is manifested by entities which are like us, entities like the fields of the quantum fields, for example, particles. They are entities that are actually have, the properties that I said earlier, in identity. In fact, all the electrons are the same. They have the capacity to act, and which is communication. So the states of the fields, which are what we call particles, are actually symbols, the symbols with which the field communicate with each other, and they have consciousness. So they have they know themselves, and they want to know more of themselves by interacting with each other. And so that's why particles interact with each other. That's why atoms and molecules interact with each other. That's why our bodies can exist as physical bodies. But all of this is the symbolic aspect of reality, not the semantic aspect of reality, which is the meaning. The meaning is what knowing oneself means. We get the sense of who we are, and that it gets deeper and deeper, ever more complex, because the complexity, this complexity is essentially the geometry, if you want, of that is inherent in geometries that are incredibly complex in n-dimensional spaces. That are the geometries that describe the structure within the meaning, within the knowing, which then we try to reflect symbolically to communicate, because the fundamental level of communication is onomatopoeic. It's just like, in other words, the symbols has to reflect as much as possible of the structure of the meaning. So the structure of the symbol is as similar as possible to the structure of the meaning, but because the meaning is infinite, because it's made of quantum bits, the structure is made of classical bits, the classical bits can only reflect so much of that meaning, which is can only be known from the inside, cannot be copied, cannot be reproduced from the outside, even by the person that has the meaning. So that's so much for purpose and meaning. And then why are we part wholes? I mentioned earlier that when one knows itself, he knows itself in its totality, but he knows itself in that instant, and the next instant is a new instant. And so one that knows itself in that instant has to contain all of itself in that self-knowing. And also, if it contains all of itself in that self-knowing, that entity that is created anew has to then has the same property of one and can know itself and can in turn create other entities. In fact, life is what it is. Life is the fact that one essentially reproduces itself. So the reproduction, which is the most unbelievable capacity that has a living organism to create from within itself another self and divide like a cell, is what one is doing. So life is as fundamental as the universe, as one, as consciousness, and has free will. And free will is because if there wasn't free will, what one would have to follow a plan, would have to follow some law that is that predetermines the direction. That would not be an open inquiry about itself, and so it doesn't make any sense. And the interesting thing is that even the symbols in this in this physical world, which is a small portion of the possible physical worlds that might exist, even that repeats the same pattern. Our body is made of 50 trillions, 30, 40 trillions, whatever, trillions, tens of trillions of cells. Each cell contains the genome of the egg, which is the genome of the entire organism. So within each cell, there is the potential knowledge of the whole organism. So each cell of our body is a part whole, like we are a part whole of one. This is incredible. A computer doesn't have that structure. A computer has transistors, a transistor on, off, doesn't know anything about the rest of the system, where every part of us has the potential knowledge of the rest of the system, of the totality of the organism. So, and it is a symbol because, the body, after a while, dies. We don't, but the body dies because the body is an expression, is a communication symbol of a self, a vaster self than the ego, which is the part that believes to be the body, which we generally thinks we are the ego. But we are vaster entities than the ego. And so that vaster entity, which is where the free will comes from, that continues to exist even after our death. So what does it mean? We don't need a computer to this singularity to have our to transfer transfer experience and consciousness into a computer and live forever. I mean, we don't have to do that because we live forever. We don't have that problem. The problem is of the people that don't understand what's going on.
And so is that one of the implications you think the understanding of this message would have for how we live our lives?
Oh, the implication is that by being part wholes of one, we have to have the same type of cooperation that the cells of my body that are part wholes of my body need to have in order for my body to stay together as an organism that supports whatever my consciousness, vaster consciousness, wants to do. So cooperation instead of competition is the actual correct world. I mean, science is saying that the reason for our existence is the survival of the fittest. There is nothing more dangerous ideologically than this kind of idea. If the survival of the fittest was the real principle of life, we could not exist. The cells would have figured out ways to kill each other and never have any multicellular organism that requires cooperation in order to stay together. And we have 50 trillions of them that reasonably stay together. If we get sick, it's likely that our consciousness has something to do with it. Not our consciousness per se, but some misunderstanding of consciousness may have something to do with that. So the understanding that cooperation is the foundation of life and the foundation of existence changes completely the ethos that now drives our society, which is, everything is driven by competition. Now, I don't mean when I speak about this competition, it's the competition of the survival of the fittest, because survival means killing to survive in this concept, in this context. I'm not talking the competition, the sort of amicable competition that people that want to kind of, see who runs a little more than the other. I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's not the problem. The problem is the competition that goes on now in Ukraine, for example. That is the kind of competition that I'm talking about. And that's the survival of the fittest kind of competition. So that is out. So isn't that a little bit of a change in the way we think about ourselves and think about life and think about the future?
Yeah. I would say so. And Bernardo, don't feel like you have to wait for me to kind of invite you in. If you have a comment or a question or a reflection that you want to add, just jump in.
I just love to listen to Federico, so I'm very happy here.
I wonder again, just because we've been immersed more in Bernardo's vocabulary as we approach this than yours, Federico. I did send out a video on the articles, but not necessarily everyone will have gone into them in depth. Could you translate, Bernardo, when Federico says symbolic or semantic? I imagine there's analogs in how you've been framing this.
Yeah, so symbolic is what I would call extrinsic appearance or representation, the result of measurement. Semantic is interiority, it's direct acquaintance, first-person experience, thing in itself. Yeah, hopefully this gives you a handle.
Hello, Federico. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you for joining us today. It's an honor to be in your presence, at least virtually. You're great. Your work is fantastic, and we're all benefiting from it immensely. My question is really to understand better your understanding of the one, what you refer to as the one, and what Bernardo calls universal consciousness or mind at large. And to understand, when you say it's the purpose of it to know itself, does that mean that initially it does not know itself, meaning that it is not meta-conscious or have higher level consciousness and symbolic, or let's say conceptual understand? So just to better understand, what is the nature of that ultimate one?
Yeah, well, the nature, the way I imagine it, because now this is real conjecture, where when I talk about definition of consciousness, definition of free will, and so on, we are beyond conjecture, because it connects really with quantum physics and what we know and what we can test and measure and so on. So now conjecturally, the one is essentially more specifically not only the totality of what exists, but also the totality of what can potentially exist. In other words, since one wants to know itself, this part that it doesn't know cannot be nothing. has to be something. So that is, I call it potential knowledge. So the potential knowledge is something that hasn't yet happened, does not exist. So that also put limits to existence in the sense that there is some kind of non-existence, but it's not non-existence because non-existence would imply nothing. Is essentially, I call it potential existence. Probably the closest analogy to this is the void of some of the Eastern religions. Is basically something which is, for the moment, an horizon for that that is you also, as an experience, that there is more to it that you can see, and which is the same way that we know that we don't know, but we know that we can know. So one knows that he can know, and the stuff that he doesn't know is this potential existence, or this void, call it whatever you want. Words don't mean much unless you you experience. So there is a sense, and I had that experience of a darkness that is alive, and all you know is alive. Is a darkness that is alive. So you know that it contains something, but you don't know that you cannot see. It's dark, but it's alive. So it's this kind of, and one is full of this kind of apparent contradictions, like quantum physics is full of apparent contradictions, because it is trying to express something that goes outside the ordinary experience that we have with our sensory system through this physical reality in which we are, for the moment, constrained. So, so one is then, therefore, is everything that can potentially exist and exist. When one knows itself, it brings into existence what it knows, which is exactly the experience that we have. That when we have a direct experience, we bring into existence what we experience. That's the essence of the profound essence of consciousness, is the capacity to bring into existence what we know. So knowing and existence are two facets, two faces of the same coin. And then because one can only know by knowing can only know itself by bringing into existence something that is holistic like itself. Then we have this, this creation of the CUs, which are like the monads of Leibniz. Leibniz was the philosopher, scientist, the mathematician that was the closest to what I'm trying to express. I mean, he basically could see that the atoms could not be the atoms of Democritus or the particles of classical physics. They had to be alive. They had to be conscious. Because how can you get more from less? Science now is claiming that you can get from inert matter, you can get conscious live matter. Come on. I mean, have they ever shown that you can that a living cell self-organize from inert matter? Not a chance. Not a chance. They've only shown that the simplest organic molecules or simple organic molecules can actually self-organize, self-organize through natural phenomena. But a cell, I mean, that's an unbelievable thing. Against the tendency to disorder of the natural world, entropy, as we know, tends to create disorder instead of order. So how can you do that without some entities that are actually doing this? But they are doing this not like a creationism. They're doing this because the symbols in which they express their own ever-increasing self-knowing become ever more complex. And so life emerged as the expression of this communication of entities, CUs, seities, monads, call them whatever you want, that actually through this process know themselves ever more, and these symbols have to represent this knowing in their own structure. A living organism is not a classical system. It's not like a computer. It's a quantum and classical system. And the essence of its operation is quantum. Only few biologists now, they have created quantum biology, begin to recognize that this has to be. And yet we don't know anything, essentially, of how a cell can actually behave like a unit, like an organism. We only know local things, you know. We study cells as biochemistry, not as information, as quantum and classical information. So we have unbelievable amount of knowledge yet to go to arrive to in the study of life. And we think that we know what life is. Not even close. So I stop here.
Thank you. May I just ask if Bernardo can just briefly comment on my question and how you see or how you've understood Federico's views with regards to meta-consciousness?
He makes sure that we understand that there is an ontic difference between a living object and a nominal non-living object, in the sense that the interiority of the living object is what we seek to describe with a wave function or a quantum state. So I am totally with him there. I think there is something about life that makes it fundamentally different from a silicon computer or any other inanimate object that you can come up with, that we sort of carve out of the whole by a nominal process of convenience, which is linguistic and not ontic in nature. So I'm totally with him on that. I mean, you'll be hard pressed to find something where I would tell you that I don't think Federico is correct. But maybe we have to work on the different words that we use, but that's all you will get. I mean, Federico made sure to explain that there are no Democritean atoms. This is, even if you're only a physicist and not a philosopher, the idea of Democritean atoms is gone from science since the late 20s, at least since the 40s, with quantum field theory. All there is, from a physical perspective, are quantum fields. And are these fields things? No, they are not things. They are the void that Federico explained as the darkness that has the potentiality to be everything that is, was, and can possibly be. And that's exactly what the quantum fields are. Excitations of the quantum fields are what we call particles, which sort of come together in an interaction process and turn into atoms. But atoms are not things. Atoms and particles are behaviors of the field. And the field isn't a thing either. So yeah, different words, but the message is the same.
I'll read a question from Yvonne, which touches on this point, I think, that in your article, Federico, you hypothesize that consciousness is a fundamental property of the quantum fields, which I think is a continuation of what you were both just saying. Is this smuggling in a form of panpsychism? So in previous lectures and conversations with Bernardo, he's been careful to distinguish between idealism and panpsychism, so this might be a little dialogue between you. It might just be a vocabulary thing. If something is the property of something else, isn't that something else more fundamental? A bit further, he mentions the increased level of consciousness related to a hierarchy of quantum fields. But if consciousness is substantial, how can it be leveled? And just let me know, Ivan, if I've misrepresented your question in some way, but that's a starting point.
Yes, I didn't get the very last words that you said. If consciousness is not, and I missed that. Just the last probably 5 seconds of what you said.
If consciousness is substantial, how can it be leveled, or how can there be hierarchy? I think.
What do you mean level? Oh, level. Have levels.
Maybe
Okay.
levels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Well, again, I want to stress that I'm not wedded to the more speculative aspects of my model. In other words, the essence of my model is one thing that finds relevance to quantum physics, to what we know. But then as we move astray further from those essential elements, I may be wrong. So, I don't want to insist too much on those aspects because it is still, it's still part of the new search that need to start by having, put a stake in the ground, which is quantum physics is actually speaking about the interiority of nature. That changes completely everything, because now we're saying consciousness, it becomes itself the instrument with which we will know reality. Not scientists don't accept that. They need instruments, physical instruments, because the reality that exists is only the one that you can measure with instruments or with your body, which is another instrument. So, this is the momentous change that I'm talking about. The rest of it is, there are ideas, there are models, and they are reasonable, plausible, but I don't want to, I don't want to create dogmas here, because it is far from me to do that. So to go back to this model, I think that in order to understand the physical reality that has clearly hierarchies of entities, from particles, atoms, or molecules. An atom is not the sum of particles. An atom is a coherent organization of states, and so is itself a complex state, but is a complex state of states. So, but it is coherent. In other words, it can only be explained through quantum physics, through vectors in Hilbert space, as mathematical structures. That's why an atom has, or a molecule has properties that are completely different than the atoms that combine into that molecule. The individual atoms have completely different properties. And so in order to explain these organizations, which are quantum, they depend on quantumness of nature, not on classical physics. They can only be explained through quantum physics, not through classical physics. The particles of Democritus can only bounce against each other, or they may stick with each other, but that's it. They cannot create something which is more than the sum of them. And so then seities, these monads, have to also combine in some sort, and then have a way of knowing themselves, their combination, in a sort of a hierarchical way. So it's a sort of combination which then is reflected in the quantum combination of the particles, which are the elementary symbols. The elementary symbols are the particles. The next level of seities are a combination of elementary seities, what I call the CUs, the consciousness units, and so in their symbols are not sums of symbols. They're not like us putting together letters of the alphabet one next to each other. That's classical information. Quantum information, when you combine, you have something new, something with new properties. That in other words, the ontology of one is that nothing can be disconnected from each other. So when you connect in a new way, you create something new. Is the ontology that as a reflection, as a representation in the physics, in the mathematics of Hilbert spaces. The mathematics of Hilbert spaces depends on complex numbers. The complex number, the I of the complex number, think about it, is not a number. The I of the complex number is not a number. It is an infinity of numbers. It can be represented as an infinite number of points in a plane. That's what I is. So when we use complex numbers, we think of a number. It's not a number. It's an infinity of things. So you see, we basically, because we start with a model that excludes certain things and doesn't, the reductionism puts boundary in things that cannot have boundaries. Within the fundamental reality, there are no boundaries. Things are always interconnected. And therefore, they cannot be described as something which is closed. Impossible. But we want to go that way, and so we want to understand that way, and we cannot understand because that's impossible to understand. That's why we don't understand quantum physics. The non-understanding of quantum physics is not an intellectual problem, it's a psychological problem. Because we don't want that world. We want a world that we can control. We want a world that is, it's our world to dominate. That's the ethos that we have in mind. And so we don't want to understand it. And then we say that nature is absurd. Come on, nature is absurd. We are absurd by thinking that nature is absurd. Because nature is us. But the us in the nature is the nature of the heart. Is not the nature or the rationality driven by the desire to control and desire to be powerful. So if we want to have a sense of another important lessons for us of this theory is what I just said. We want to dominate. We cannot dominate because we are an integral part of everything. And if we do something, if we do harm to another, we do it to ourselves. If we do some good to another, we'll do it to ourselves because we are all connected.
Great. And just a quick technical point, I'm using spotlights for the first time. So it's nice to have you spotlit, Bernardo, I think, as a kind of open invitation to say, to come in with anything you want to reflect at any point. But
I can add something at this point.
Yeah, feel free to unspotlight yourself if ever you want to. But great, thank you.
Should I?
Yeah, go for it.
Can I say something? Okay. I think I know where the original question is coming from. So I subscribe to everything Federico said, but to speak the language of the person who asked the question, the panpsychist that I mean when I say panpsychism is not true is what in philosophy is technically called constitutive panpsychism. And that philosophical view is very quantum naive. A constitutive panpsychist regards reality as made of particles, and particles as things, as little beads that collide and join together, things defined in space and time with clear boundaries. That is not what physics has been saying since at least Richard Feynman and quantum electrodynamics in the 1940s. So panpsychism, constitutive panpsychism, is physically inconsistent. Now, when Federico talks about particles, he's talking about symbols, not interiority. When he talks about quantum states, which are entangled states, that's the interiority. But then there are no things separate from one another in a quantum state, because that's the definition of entanglement. Say, two photons are produced together, so they come out of a prepared state, as we say in physics. They are entangled. You are no longer able to say that there are two photons. There is only the entangled system. There aren't things that are separate and somehow interacting in a quantum state. There is only the quantum state, and it's unitary. Parts cannot be described separate from one another. That's the definition of a quantum state. You cannot describe the system in terms of the behavior of separate parts. It doesn't work. And that's why two entangled photons remain correlated, even if they are in opposite sides of the universe, because they are not two things. They are a quantum system. So in Federico's terminology, when you're talking about the interiority of the world, you are talking about what we describe as quantum state. And there are no things, there are no Democritean particles, and therefore the structure of consciousness is not the structure of separate parts. Although that's what panpsychism says, and panpsychism is therefore just wrong because it doesn't understand physics.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, the tradition of panpsychism falls down on the what is called the combination problem. In other words, the fact that two entities that combine could create another entity which has a consciousness that is more than the sum of the two. And because panpsychism is essentially based on classical physics, not on quantum physics, cannot explain this, and therefore it cannot. Panpsychism has to be quantum, and then quantum panpsychism, fine, okay, you can give me whatever name you want, because it's completely different than the panpsychism that most people intend when they use the word panpsychism. I'm not a philosopher, okay? I am an intuitive guy that however is rational, but doesn't hide behind complex words, because I found that words in reality imprison, because they are limited in their capacity to express. And when everything is interconnected, then we actually do not have any way symbolically with finite symbols, which therefore are definitely defined, they have boundaries automatically, to express the meaning, which is what is the ontology of reality. So the meaning is the ontology, is the interiority of reality, the best description, which is not a description, because meaning, an identical meaning would be the description, but that is impossible even with the quantum states to describe. So the quantum states are the closest representation, not description, representation of the meaning, which is the ontology. So the classical symbol, on the other hand, which is the bit, is substantially less, infinitely less than what can be expressed by quantum states. But even the quantum state is not the experience. You see, the quantum state is the theory of the experience. The quantum state is the representation of an experience that can only be known from the inside, and it's it. Can only be known from the inside, period.
And we'll maybe go to Nicola in a second. There's a question on bits. But just before we do, I'm just curious if this is more widely accepted by the scientific community. Is it likely that the study of subjective states, including what we might call extreme subjective states induced by psychedelics or meditation or spiritual masters, will somehow be integrated into science, or will science have to be continually restricted to the symbolic realm? Does the question make sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense. Absolutely. The reality is not made of two separate silos. A reality is made of one reality that can be known from the inside and from the outside, but the real knowing is only inside. So, in other words, I want to know myself. To know myself, because I'm a part whole of one, I need to know essentially every aspect of one through my point of view, through my point of view. I'm still a point of view, a unique point of view of one. So even when I know the meaning of another, because we communicate with symbols, with classical symbols, I know with my own qualia, in a sense, my own qualia, the way I represent within myself the self-knowing, which is we call qualia, but the meaning is the essence, is what qualia is pointing to. The meaning is the essence of qualia. The essence of qualia, in my view, can be the same, because one cannot be divided. So the point is that through the understanding of another, we can achieve the same meaning, but perceived with different qualia. But it's the same meaning, because each qualia, my set of qualia is different than Bernardo's set, qualia set. And I don't know if it's red is, the actual, what it feels like, color red is the same representation, the same qualia that I have, for example. There is no way to answer that question. But the meaning, because the meaning is the essence of what one wants to know. The meaning, my meaning eventually has to be the same as Bernardo. And it is exactly when the meaning between entities that communicate reaches the maximum level that can be obtained, that is the common meaning, then there is a new entity that is born, that can go deeper on that joint meaning of the entities that are communicated. So this is now an hypothesis, but that would explain how entities would communicating with each other, then merge and become a new entity that continues to learn. But that would be a new birth, would be like giving birth to a baby by two human beings communicating and having sex and creating a new entity that mixes up. This is a sort of the symbolic aspect of, in the world of appearance, the symbolic aspect of what at a much deeper level and a much vaster level conscious entities are trying to do, to create entities that can go deeper into the joint common meaning that is being achieved through the communications, symbolic communication. So of a quantum state, you need to prepare, a lot of states in the same level, and then you can do a tomography and coming close. If you were to do an infinite number of copies, you can actually reproduce a quantum state, but you cannot do infinite copies, so you can never reproduce it. But is this tomography, except in the opposite, we are joining two entities once they achieve a common meaning that through communication that allows to a new entity to emerge, to continue the self-knowing of one at a higher level of complexity and cognizance.
And apologies if you answered this and I just hadn't understood. Do you anticipate this changing how science is conducted, or the kind of experiments that science will do in the future or try and corroborate?
Oh yeah, but I expect that it would take a long time before scientists will accept what I'm saying. I mean, look, entanglement, it took 80 years before everybody had to agree, willing or not, that entanglement exists, and it has the properties that were determined by the experiments, by the experimental evidence. I mean, Einstein didn't believe that entanglement could exist. It was, it had to be some limitation of the quantum theory. So, and for 50 years now, since experiments could not even prove that entanglement existed, entanglement was kind of lost, was forgotten. And then when when the aspect who just got the Nobel Prize for this in '92 had did the first experiment that showed that entanglement actually exists, then many physicists raise all kinds of objections. It's impossible. You didn't do it right. It cannot be. Blah blah blah. Well, the last experiment that closed all the loopholes was done in 2014. So it took another 30 years to close all the loopholes. And at that point, nobody could say that entanglement does not exist. So 80 years later, scientists accepted the existence of entanglement. So you can imagine what I'm saying is much worse. So I will be long gone before anybody would need to answer the question that you raised, because that question requires that people have accepted this theory. There has been sufficient experimental evidence of it, and so on, which will take many years. And so, but then looking, say, 200 years in the future, then yes, I see that science will have to be a science of the interiority and the exteriority of the universe. It cannot be just the science of the exteriority. Once you accept that the interiority is not epiphenomenal, but exists, is real, in fact, more real than the other one that you thought was the only reality, well, then everything changes. And how is it going to go? God knows. I mean, I couldn't even tell what the microprocessor, after I did the first, what would happen 20 years later. I mean, come on. The creativity of people is enormous. So it's impossible to tell the consequences of these things.
Great. So plea for patience, I'm hearing. Nicola, do you want to read your question?
Yes.
Yes.
So, hi, Federico. Hi, Bernardo. So the question is, I hope it still makes sense after I formulated it the first time, but you basically say that, there are infinite quantum states that somehow represent also the experience, so to say, and that only a few bits of these quantum states are selected in the information that we actually see or we can communicate. So the question would be like, how is the selection done? So how do we go from infinite quantum states to the selection of what happens, basically?
Well, in quantum physics, there are transformations. They're called atomic transformations that do exactly that. They transform quantum to classical information. So, and in fact, and those transformations explain quantum physics without having to talk about the collapse of the wave function, because there are irreversible transformation, is atomic transformation, that maintain the purity of the state and also transform a quantum state into a classical state. So those are transformations that don't exist in the orthodox quantum physics, but they exist in quantum information, and they're known to exist. So.
Okay, thanks. And they are deterministic, or?
Oh yeah, the collapse of the wave function is clearly deterministic, because the state that manifests, nobody knows. And in fact, according to the fact that entanglement exists, is telling you that the state that manifests cannot be decided prior to the manifestation of the state. In other words, the probability of quantum physics does not refer to a lack of knowledge of something that already exists, like in a deterministic system, like in the probability of a classical system, but refers to the lack of the existence of what is pointing to. So it is consistent only with a free will decision that actually manifests without any algorithm which would be required if it was a deterministic system. And without any algorithm, determines what you're going to see. So what you're going to see is actually the expression of a free will decision, and that will be a atomic transformation, which which is known to exist. So free will is consistent with quantum theory when you do not accept the unitarity postulate, which is a postulate that Professor Dariano has shown that it is non-falsifiable, and therefore it should not be used. So unitarity produces a deterministic, in the sense of probability, a deterministic probability, which is kind of a little bit of an oxymoron, but it produces a deterministic system that then needs to collapse with a irreversible transformation from Hilbert space into space-time, and of course that collapse of the wave function is the problem of the measurement that has never been solved, because it's not determined by any equation. It's something that nobody knows how it happens. With this new theory, is free will. It's the free will that collapses the wave function by a choice.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. So from now on, I'm going to ask you to read your question. If you stay silent, I'll just read it myself. And then as you start to ask, just say if you're happy to be spotlit, which means your image will be recorded, and some of it may one day end up on YouTube. So just kind of be aware of that. Stephen Davies.
Would you say that the I, the imaginary part, the imaginary number in quantum mechanics, represents that consciousness is beyond the logical?
No, I'm not saying that quantum mechanics, the consciousness goes beyond logic. I mean, but the logic of consciousness is most likely even more subtle than the logic of quantum physics, which is so subtle that we couldn't understand the entanglement for the longest time, because it puts into question the locality of physics, which we didn't want to abandon. So today we know that, for example, we know that entanglement exists, but we cannot understand it. So, and also we know that it's not contradictory. So it's not violating logic, but it is a property that brings into question the nature of space, because this is a known local phenomenon. So it is simply pointing to something that we still don't understand, which is the nature of space. And of course, most theoretical physicists will agree that they don't understand what space and time is, and also space and time which is the space, time, and mass, which is the essence of general relativity, cannot be unified with quantum physics. And so already we know that there is something mysterious about space and time, and how space and time relates to the quantumness of nature. So that points to the same direction. But logic must be there. Without logic, a logic, however, that is so subtle that it is the same logic that produces the Gödel's theorems, of incompleteness, that tells you that you may make statements that cannot be proven to be either true or false. And that's which means that you can go, in my mind, that means that you can go both ways. Some scientists may decide that the reality that they want to explore is the reality of yes on the answer to a statement, and another group may decide to explore the reality that is a no, like non-Euclidean geometries. I mean, we thought that for the longest time that the fifth postulate, the parallel postulate, was was correct, but since it could not be falsified using the other four, why don't we take also for true the postulate in which the parallel meets, or the other in which the parallels diverge? So now, in that way, we created Riemannian geometry and Lobachevsky's geometry. So through those, by accepting the fact that logic cannot be complete, all of a sudden we create worlds which are unbelievably different from each other, and yet they have to exist.
Thank you. Are you familiar, Federico, with Rupert Spira, the non-dual teacher?
A little bit, yes.
Yeah, he's another guest coming later in the course, just for some context. And there's several people who have joined this who are familiar with his work and curious about his work. And I think some of the questions in the chat come from those perspectives. So as you may have gathered, some people with more scientific knowledge, and there's some with more, let's say, meditative or non-dual inquiry experience. And so there were a couple of questions, if you're open to sharing a little bit more of the details about those initial experiences you had, and how you, what practices or meditations or teachings you were following that you felt might have induced them.
Well, I never follow any teachings to the point of identifying with that teaching, sort of becoming like following a master. I'm not a master, and I don't accept others as masters in the sense that they know everything that there is to know. In fact, one doesn't know. In my theory, one doesn't know. It's still trying to know. It's still trying to know itself, and will continue to do so because it is potentially infinite, and therefore it never gets there. And that explains why the evolution of the universe continues and can continue in unexpected ways, because is open-ended, because it's driven by free will, and it's driven by a nature which is not predetermined. So for example, many of my experiences came through different school of thinking, and they are not necessarily correlated with the sort of the notions or the concepts of that school of thinking. They were, that was a being immersed in that world allowed me to connect with certain aspect of myself, for example, that had little to do with what was the teaching. In other words, my experiences did not follow the teaching. They came through my trying to understand by going to different schools of thoughts, and then in that milieu of intense trying to understand, experiences came. For example, I experienced myself, my consciousness, as a point of light in the base of the sternum. So I was a point of light, period. All that I was a point of light. And it was like, wow, that's me. Wow, or I experienced myself everywhere, in the trees, in the grass, and so I was everywhere. Or I experienced myself where there was no self. So there was only a field of experience, but nobody watching. Wow. Or I experienced myself in which I was so immersed into the experience, like a child that plays, that there was no longer the notion of me. Is that non-dual? I don't know. Is the other one non-dual? I don't know. I don't want to put names to things, because then when we put names, we constrain them, we put boundaries, and then we reason, and then we cannot agree because we reason about something we don't understand, we don't even know. what we're talking about. We are only reasoning on the definitions. I mean, that's not what experiencing is about. Now, the reasoning helps. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but if we take it too seriously, we move away from what is the real ontology, which is in the experiential knowing, direct knowing. That is the ontology. Anything else is description of something, mere representation of something, but not the something. And in fact, as I said before, quantum physics does not describe the experience. It's a representation of the experience, because the experience can only be known from the inside by the experiencer, period.
And just again, opening that invitation, Bernardo, whenever you have a reflection you want to share.
I misused words, and Federico corrected me earlier. So the idea of what is a representation, what is a description. So in Federico's perspective, which is my own as well, the interiority is the thing in itself.
Yeah.
The classical states, or the physical world, is the representation thereof. And then we can use mathematics to describe the representation.
Yeah. Yeah. And we go at many levels of abstraction. And that's why, you can have, for example, you can have, virtual computers, right? I mean, it's the game that we do also with classical information. You can have an infinite regress of virtual computers, one inside the other, and on it goes, right? So I mean, fine, but it's all games. That's all games of symbols. You see, we are imposing our reality into matter, which is the classical matter, which is quite pliable, and we can structure the way we want. But then we cannot say that that's real in the same sense that it is real our experience, because that matter cannot experience anything. If the experience can only be described by quantum information, as a minimum, you would want a quantum system, which is really to be able to be conscious, which is our body, is a quantum classical system. So the reason why we can connect with our quantum nature, which is behind the body, is the one which is everywhere, is a field that controls the body. And when the body dies, that field stays where it was. So the way it is like this, it can tell you that a computer can never be conscious, because a computer, is made of classical information, which can be copied. So it would violate the principle that our experience is private, which we all know it is. So if there is anything self-evident, that is self-evident, that we exist, and that we exist as a private entity with a private experience. That's, Descartes, right?
I think what happens today, because I fight a similar battle to you. I am always confronted with this question: isn't artificial intelligence also artificially conscious? And I just sort of throw my hands up and go, oh, here we go again. But what you see today, and that's not how it was in your time, even in my time when I studied computer engineering in the early 90s, we built computers. We knew how to go from sand to something that boots into an operating system. But what you see today with a lot of people who study computer science, they have no idea how computers are built. They operate on multiple layers of abstraction and libraries and tooling, and they turn those abstractions into even more abstract operators and turn computer science into a form of logic. And those are the guys who have no idea what a computer actually is. They are the guys who go around saying, well, yeah, the computer is conscious. They don't have a clue, and that's dangerous, because they also carry PhDs behind their names.
I completely agree with that. But basically, it is the essence of that problem is confusing a theory of reality with reality. Confusing a theory of reality with reality. And we do it all the time. I used to do it myself. So it's so seductive because then you can explain, but what you explain the math, which is a theory of reality. You don't explain reality because the reality can only be known from the inside.
What you just said is the one thing that characterizes the entirety of analytic philosophy today. It's the conflation between a conceptual arrangement, which is a theory of reality, with reality itself. Because they have achieved liftoff from reality. They are no longer connected with reality. All they have is that conceptual arrangement, which they then take for reality. This is the greatest plague in philosophy today. It is exactly what you described.
Yeah, and because they have achieved consensus, then then it makes him more sure, because, well, he agrees with me, the other guys agrees with me, so therefore we all agree, so therefore it must be that way. This is how how lemmings go down the I stop here.
Oh, you brought the picture of the game Lemmings back to my mind. Lemmings on the Amiga 1000, the falling off the cliff and dying.
Falling off the cliff.
I'm back to
Aren't we having fun? Aren't we having fun?
I'm happy to have a reference point here that I'm also very familiar with on an Amiga 500 nonetheless. So
that came a little later, but it still counts.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm catching up. And speaking of catching up, I'll just insert one question here, which I think will interest many people. So my understanding is, if we really understand your proposition, more people who are open to science will be open to exploring their interior experience and be open to to taste the chocolate for themselves, as you said.
Yeah.
To what extent? So I have no scientific background myself, and I think many people here also. To what extent do you feel like our subjective explorations, our contemplative explorations, our philosophical explorations, someone like me would be aided by, given that I'm probably, most of us are not going to be able to get PhDs in quantum field theory. To what extent do you think those internal explorations would be aided by as much knowledge as we can accrue of what science has understood so far? Does the question make sense? Was it audible?
Yeah, basically, at the highest level, I see that our inner search can illuminate the outer search, and vice versa. So they will self-pollinate, and to some extent we have always done that, because any new science has really started from the intuition, from some kind of some kind of phenomenon that we couldn't understand, and we struggle to imagine, to figure it out within ourselves as scientists, to try to find a solution to an understanding through a very inner process. Not by chance, the early pioneers of quantum physics, almost all of them had a high level of affinity with for example, the spiritual teachings of the East, for example, or with the philosopher, with the pre-Socratics, but there was a resonance to deep philosophical thought that precedes a theory. And so what I see is much more of this, because the reality, I suspect that, based on my own experiences, the reality is so much more than what we think it is, that we would never end up with things to explore and things to connect together, because all reality is connected. So there isn't separate things. They are all connected. Maybe they are not connected directly, but they are connected through 3 other different realities, and eventually you go around. But everything has to be interconnected, because even quantum physics is saying that reality, the universe, is holistic. Entanglement is telling them much. Everything is connected with everything else. So we know that. So it's that we don't like it, because we would like the universe to be the classical universe that we know, we can control, we can get our way, you know, all of that. So,
Nigel, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think it's just fantastic, the experience this evening about your passion and heart, as well as your outstanding intellect. And here we are communicating with you, probably using the very technology that you developed. So fantastic. My specific question is around, I watched a presentation by Professor Dariano in Oxford on awareness and the operational theoretical approach to awareness and the operational probability theory. And he mentioned that through the Federico and Elvia Faggin Foundation, Dan Hoffman was doing some experimental work to confirm the theory. And I just wanted to know how that's proceeding.
okay, so Don Hoffman was not doing any experimental work on the theory of Dariano. In fact, when Dariano made that presentation at Oxford, it was, we almost were there, but there was still some stuff missing. And so the actual essence of the theory with Dariano is a paper that is now a chapter of a book that came out this year. The title of the book is Artificial Intelligence versus Natural Intelligence. And it has one of the chapters, it's not a thick book. And one of the chapters is on this quantum information-based panpsychism. We call it panpsychism, but the quantum in front changes from what we talked about earlier, changes the nature of the panpsychism. It's still panpsychism in this broad sense that that consciousness is fundamental, and so there was some additional work done that clarified the theory, made it much more connected. And also Don Hoffman never did experimental work on that. And in fact, Don Hoffman was not quite convinced about that theory. And where Dariano and I were right on. I felt that my model before that was a complete match of the theory, in which he contributed the fact that a quantum state, by being non-clonable, had the same characteristic of experience, which I said it before, but I did not make that connection. He made it, and so that's why he deserves a lot of credit for that.
I just have a clarification, either for Bernardo or for yourself, Federico. Are you basing the contextuality on the relational quantum mechanics of Rovelli alone, or is it somebody else? This was prior, and it seems like some of the things follow.
Now, the actual theory that I follow is the OPT, operational probabilistic theory of Dariano, which, for example, does not accept the unitarity postulate. And it demonstrated, as I mentioned earlier, that in fact that postulate is non-falsifiable. And so it is that postulate that changes also completely, the lack of that postulate changes completely the theory. The classical theory assumes the unitarity of transformations, and therefore begets the measurement problem, which is a consequence of that, with the collapse of the wave function. We do not have the collapse of the wave function. We have free will free will choices that are representable with atomic transformations, which is the discussion that we had earlier.
In my case, Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics is an account of the fact that measurements are contextual. So it tries to account for that by saying that, okay, all physical quantities are relational, so there are no absolutes, and therefore this is why we don't have contextuality. But contextuality in physics is not one-to-one tied with relational quantum mechanics. It's a property of measurement. They are either contextual or not. And so relational quantum mechanics is just one possible account of that.
So if Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics fell out, it was falsified, would that mean anything for your model of idealism then, or any of the postulates you put forward?
It's one of those hypotheticals, you know, what if the sun was a black hole? Well, I don't know. Latest experimental results are very well in line with relational quantum mechanics. There was a paper by Proietti and others published in 2019, I believe, just before the pandemic, which shows that as predicted by relational quantum mechanics, two different observers can have different but equally valid accounts of the same series of events, which is almost a direct confirmation of relational quantum mechanics. The weak point of it is that photons play the role of observers in that Proietti experiment, which motivated people like Sabine Hossenfelder to come up and say, well, photons are not observers, therefore it means nothing. Well, that goes too far, but there is more work to do. The whole thing is based on the thought experiment by Eugene Wigner, Wigner's friend experiment. And that is the way to try to get some definitive experimental confirmation of the relational nature of all physical quantities. But it would take many technological steps for us to be able to replace a photon with a macroscopic entangled quantum system to play the role of observer in our interference experiments. It's been talked about. It was talked about last week in the latest conference on the subject. We are not there yet, but in defense of relational quantum mechanics, one could say that it is not an interpretation, it's an acknowledgement of the implications of original quantum theory. It's just a direct implication of quantum theory. And that places relational quantum mechanics at least at a very different level epistemically than many worlds interpretation, than the hidden variables of superdeterminism and all those fantastical theoretical fantasies for which we have precisely zero empirical substantiation.
I want to note one thing, that photons, you cannot assign a reference frame to a photon. So you know, to have a photon as an observer without a reference frame is kind of an oxymoron. In other words, that's where, for example, quantum physics meets with relativity, right? And so there is such a confusion today that we need to, in a way, we need to reframe the problem. And I think that the reframing of the problem that could start with this theory with Ariano and I could be a good way to start, and it might lead to the new concepts that are needed to join, to connect quantum physics with general relativity. But that's, you know, that's an hope as opposed to, you know, a certainty. But
to address your original question, Kyle, more directly, if all physical quantities are relational, that refutes physicalism and plays right in the hands of idealism. That's for sure. But if that were not the case, if physical quantities were not relational, would that invalidate idealism? No, it wouldn't, because you could still have stable representations of the ontic nature of the world. Physicality as a representation can still be stable and definite, and while remaining a representation and not the thing in itself, not the interiority, but the appearance, the representation of the interiority. So the refutation doesn't go both ways. That said, the evidence based on Bell's theorem, and later on Tony Leggett's theorems in Foundations of Physics 2003, and the experimental confirmation of all those inequalities makes it extremely unlikely today that physical quantities are not contextual. That would be a bizarre result that would contradict decades of experimentation.
Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Kyle. Great. Excuse me if I mispronounce this. Saliha on free will and time.
Hello, hi everybody. I just am so excited to be here with both of you, and I'm also feel like we have to talk about time, because sort of what the connection is, and I'm so curious, Federico Faggin, what your perspective is on time in connection to free will. Free will is essential for consciousness. If consciousness is evolving, then where does time separate from space? I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
Separate space is emergent, like Rovelli says, and Lee Smolin, and so kind of bringing them into the conversation here, and what the connection is with mind at large, and if consciousness and time could be the same thing, and that's what's happening here is time, and it feels like the most creative force. It creates everything as a product of time. All the things that we experience as a product of time. Space is a product of time. So what is that connection there?
I think that I would say as much as you said, but I don't know. Frankly, it's still work in progress. I mean, the nature of time, certainly the nature of the time that we have, the ordinary time, is absolutely a construction of the brain. So that I don't even have a problem with that. But what is the essence of time? Has changed, because if one knows itself more later, it would imply some kind of time, right? Some kind of later and before. And so many traditions also claim that there is no time. In many experiences of mine, time did not seem to exist. There was change, but not time. So I'm still baffled. I don't know. I don't have an answer. So that's certainly one of the deepest problems that we'll have to eventually come to confront and solve. Certainly, space is relatively easy to think in terms of, space comes with the object, so to speak. It doesn't exist without objects. In other words, it doesn't exist without states. It doesn't exist without fields. It's a construction. It's a construction that is even more transparent, so to speak. But time in the sense of change, in the sense of becoming, that's a hard one. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, it just feels like we've thrown time out with space, and physics has sort of thrown it out too, as not as an illusion. And I just feel like it's telling us something. It's representing something so powerful, and I'm just so curious about what its role is in the deepest reality, the deepest truth of our nature.
Well, in some way, in the deepest level, time is the fact that there is becoming. But how do you need time to measure becoming? How can you have becoming without time? Because for us, time is connected directly to change. So how can you have change without time? That's the question that I don't have an answer. And yet, in my experiences, I could say that there had been experiences in which there was no time, but there was change, there was experience, there was dynamic, and there was not even an observer in that case. So that beats me. It's part of something that eventually may be explainable, but certainly we have no idea. I don't have any idea now how to explain it, other than I had that experience, and so I know that it's real somehow, and I don't know how can I explain something that there is change, there is dynamism, but there is no time. In that case, there wasn't even an observer. I don't know. Does it mean that the observer, but the fact that I remember that experience, how can you remember the experience then? All this kind of stuff. Where is the memory? There is. I have a huge list of questions that need to be answered. And in some, I have some tentative answers. In others, I don't even have a tentative answer. It's a new territory, basically. And of course, don't think that physicists know everything there is to know about the universe as they have, framed it. That there are hundreds and hundreds of unsolved questions in physics that people simply don't deal with them because they don't have an answer. So they study something else.
They're all evolving. All the laws of physics evolve in time.
Say it again.
The laws of physics themselves are also evolving in time.
Well, no, but physics doesn't say that. I mean, I'm saying that the laws of physics, but laws of physics, they continue to evolve, but there are some. The first level laws are being settled. They evolved and they got there. Then then the new level evolves and then it gets there. Then the next level evolves and it gets there. So is a step-by-step consolidation, because once you have understood a certain level of reality sufficiently to create a language, you don't need any more laws, because that language has to be open-ended. It cannot describe everything. It can only describe probabilistically what you will discover later, just like our languages. Our languages allow me to write a book in 5 years from now that I haven't even decided what I'm going to talk about, because it's open-ended. The meaning, not because the meaning that I will describe 5 years from now will be the same as what I have now. No. The meaning is the one that I will transform into symbols, in new combination of symbols that were never combined before in that way. So the future, the laws must have this property from the very beginning. That's why quantum physics has to be probabilistic and indeterministic. It cannot, if it wasn't, we will live in a deterministic universe, and we wouldn't be conscious.
It's a timeless universe too. A determined universe is a timeless one. But when time comes in, then the potentiality and the quantum potentiality can exist.
Yeah, but in quantum physics, for example, time is not the time of classical physics. Is simply a parameter. It's a parameter that we use to see the evolution of the quantum state. So it doesn't have is a parameter, however, that that could run at the there could be related somehow to other parameters. I don't know. I just don't want to even speculate. I mean, that's where my model has nothing. There's not much to say yet. Hopefully, because I keep on thinking about this stuff, but hopefully, I will know that we don't.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elvia. Thanks. So I think, speaking of time, I believe we'll hopefully have time for two last quick questions. One which I've been asked to read out because Joanna's question, she's having sound issues. Sorry, before I do that, Bernardo, did you want to come in on any of what was just?
No, it's okay.
Yeah. Joanna asks, and it's a question from way back at the beginning of your presentation, I think, when you were talking about consciousness being experience, and she's saying, surely experiences can only give you a limited personal knowledge of something. and it's always dependent on the experiencer's interpretation through their senses, etc. And although they can be corroborated between individuals as being somewhat similar, would you agree that there is a more direct form of knowing which bypasses the intellect and the senses, in other words, wisdom?
So basically, the direct experience is completely different than the ordinary experience of consciousness. The direct experience that you have when you are in, states of consciousness that are non-ordinary, let's call it, that brings, for example, a certainty to your experience, not that you can explain it, but a certainty about what you experience. You cannot doubt what you experience. And that kind of doubt is actually not, would be there in an ordinary experience if you really want to, go to it. So, for example, in my awakening experience, the sense that the stuff that I was feeling, which was love, enormous love, with a joy and peace, all kind of, mixed together, that stuff was the stuff out of which everything was made. Somehow, it was so strong that it would be self-evident, like what we say, self-evidence. It was beyond the certainty that you can get even from it, the mathematical theorem, proving a mathematical theorem, because even mathematical theorems are based on the presumed truth or the postulates that you use in that particular theory within which that statement is being formulated. So logic is less sure in a way, is very sure within a set of postulates, but the set of postulates must be self-evident. And that self-evidence is what direct experience brings, that self-evidence that makes you say, it cannot be any other way, or it may be, if it is another way, it will not change the experience. The experience brings that certainty that there is something here that has these characteristics. And you can then struggle to bring together what those experiences into a coherent discourse. But the data is that direct experience is so strong and so powerful that that it cannot be wrong in its essence, not in the details, but in its essence.
If I could just reflect that back to see if I'm starting to understand it, there might be an experience that everything is made of love, as an example, and that might not represent, if I've understood you, an ultimate truth, but there's an aspect of reality that it can be an experience that way, which is like a direct knowing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you, Bernardo, in terms of your understanding of, because you've spoken sometimes of psychedelic experiences, and they can come with such certainty, but they don't necessarily represent something about ultimate.
Well, when you have an experience, it exists as such, as an experience. We tend to try to derive implications from the existence of an experience, and there you can have a discussion, are these implications valid or not? But the existence of the experience is definitively proven by the having of the experience. There is no escaping that. I'm not the most well-rounded idealist alive. Federico is, and the reason I am not is that I am weak on the experiential side. So I can't add much more to what Federico said. The way I see this is the following. People like Federico, they are blazing the trail, they are going ahead, and I follow behind, writing down the maps. That's basically what I do.
The question is about, with your current models and ideas, what are the questions that interest you the most? Hopefully, if you could both answer. I was thinking about Bernardo's comments on Patrick Harpur and the last chapter in Science Ideated. I found that really interesting.
Patrick, I think, is right up there amongst the three authors alive who do not get anywhere near as much attention as they should. The disparity between how well known Patrick is and the importance of his message and the brilliancy with which he articulates that message in a translogical manner. And when I say translogical, I mean something that exceeds Aristotelian logic, not a logic as a principle. I agree with Federico that ultimately everything complies to some logic. Things are not internally inconsistent, otherwise they aren't, if you know what I mean. They can't contradict themselves, otherwise there is nothing there to contradict. So there is a logic, but Patrick explains things in a way that transcends Aristotelian logic, those 5 axioms that we sort of take for granted, but without examining further. And I think it's brilliant what he does. It's ultimately not fully satisfying because he doesn't give you an answer, and we want an answer. And he doesn't give you one. He points at it. He walks around it. He suggests it. He talks around it, but he doesn't say, okay, this is it. But that's part of the magic of reading Patrick Harpur, is that you remain with that aftertaste. The book remains with you after you've finished it. So if it depended on me, the number of people who read Patrick Harpur should be multiplied by 1 million or something like that. Now, directly to your question, what I think is the most tantalizing unanswered question, and Federico has just talked about it, it's the nature of time. It's the most tantalizing unanswered question. I think we will learn a lot by being a little bit more sophisticated in our thinking regarding time. And physics is getting there with quantum gravity or loop quantum gravity, whatever flavor of quantum gravity you want to look at. It entails a sort of a reduction of time, reducing time to something else that isn't time. And what are the implications of that? Who will win that race to find the most internally consistent account of time? Is time even really there? There are people who say time is not there at all, like Julian Barbour, who wrote an entire book called The End of Time, in which he rewrote all the basic equations of physics without T, without time. And then you have other people like Lee Smolin who say, well, I can reduce space to time, but time is primary. Well, the jury is out. We don't know. I think one of the most promising approaches to it is that of Professor Bernard Carr from Queen Mary University, London, in which he's trying to regard time not as one dimension, but as a multidimensional coordinate system. And that may sound inflationary at first, unparsimonious, but I don't think it is, because the explanatory power is such that it makes sense to go that way. But I don't know, for me, it's the thing I consider to be the greatest mystery. I would put it above the nature of matter. I think we have the answers. It's a matter of accepting the answers that reason and logic give us, and first-person insight. I would put it above UAPs, all this talk of UAPs and what they are, and they contradict the laws of physics. Yeah, that's all fine, but time is the ticket. Time is the thing with a big bullseye on the wall, and that's what we have to reconcile ourselves with.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bernardo. I mean, it's because in the case of time, I cannot even formulate a sensible hypothesis. You know what I mean? Where in other aspects of my model, I can grasp something that can kind of make sense as a placeholder, maybe only, but sufficient sense to take seriously and proceed. When it comes to time, I'm at a loss. I really am at a loss. So there you go, time.
It's discombobulating because it's at the same time obviously there. Yesterday is gone, tomorrow hasn't arrived yet. And it's obviously not there. Where is it? That
Where
is
is it?
only
What
ever
is,
the
what
present.
is it? Where is it? What
Yeah.
is it?
Can you point at it? No, it's
I
nowhere.
don't-
It's discombobulating.
yeah. Yeah.
Would you say it is somehow related to coherence? Federico has talked a lot about making perceptions cohere, and Bernardo about you have an experience as an experience, but the implication seems to need that mediation. And I don't know, how could we expand coherence in our own perception so as to digest
about
more
time?
It seems related. It's like a funnel, or it feels, I mean, phenomenological, not the scientific description of time. It's like we need reality in little bits.
The problem of trying to account for time is that when you account for something, usually you step out of it and you try to account for it from the outside. At least conceptually. But when it comes to time, we can't, because time is built into what Noam Chomsky would call the universal grammar. The basic templates of our reasoning have time built right into them. Language has time built into it. Verbs are actions that unfold in time. Tenses. The very notion of causality is time bound. A cause precedes the effect. Not necessarily, well, let's not go to the sophistications of the latest physics, but our understanding of causality, of account, of explanation, of reduction has time built right into it. So when you try to account for time in a rational way, you immediately face a kind of circularity, because you're bringing time into your effort to account for time. And that's why things get so difficult. So I think a proper account for time would require a leap in our very modes of reasoning. The way to address it is to begin with a kind of self-transformation, which is possible. We think today in terms that 500 years ago would have been completely incommensurable with the way people thought. So it's not like, I'm not saying it's fundamentally impossible. I'm saying it's not something that you and I will ever be able to do. It would take a baby born, I don't know how many hundreds of years from now, to build its cognitive system through cultural references in such a way that an account of time becomes plausible, possible. Today, I think it's very difficult. It requires a form of conceptual acrobatics that if you even succeed, it's very difficult to bring anybody along with you. I mean, Julian Barbour tried to do this in The End of Time, a book written in 1999. And the way he explains the world without time is that kind of, it's a light cone, it's that funnel. But if you really rigorously review what he's saying, you realize that he is presupposing time. Ultimately, it doesn't look like it because he builds many layers on top, but at the bottom, he's presupposing time, which is the very thing he wants to eliminate. It's very tough. I don't know whether we can do this even as humans, or it will require a few more iterations of the evolutionary process of our cognitive system for us to be able to have an explicit, internally consistent conceptual account of time, which doesn't mean that we can't become directly acquainted with the nature of time. That's first-person experience. That is possible by the mere fact that we are part of existence, and time is part of existence. So, we share an ontic quality by the mere fact that we exist, and therefore we have direct access to whatever time may be. We exist in time, so we have direct access to it. The point I'm trying to make is, how do you conceptualize that in an explicit and self-consistent way? That's what I think is the greatest challenge.
Yeah, but it is exactly because one can experience without the sense of time that the problem exists.
There you go. Yeah, it makes it even more difficult. It sort of shoves the problem on your face, right? So look, it's a real problem. Here it is.
Yeah.
Now, good luck.
So it's not a, how to say, it's not a conjecture, that you want to answer. No, you had that experience, and so you want to explain it, but you cannot.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes it so hard.
So we can't deal with it.
If I can add another thought, our culture doesn't make it any easier because it completely fumbles the notion of time travel, for instance. The way it's portrayed in the culture is completely internally inconsistent. It's not even true or false. It doesn't even get to that point. It self-implodes. It's internally paradoxical. And the reason is we think of going back in time as a point in our own forward trajectory of time. In other words, if I had a time machine, tomorrow I could travel in time. You see, my timeline is always going forward, even when I travel in time according to the culture. And if you travel in time, but you retain the memories that you had prior to the trip in time, then you didn't travel in time, because back in time, you didn't have those memories. And to portray time travel consistently would allow for you, I, Federico, everybody, to be ping-ponging and time traveling all the time without having a clue. Because whatever we land in the arrow of time, we would have the memories that are consistent with that point in time. And we would not know we traveled in time. If I pop 30 years into the future now, at that point in time, I will have the memories I will have 30 years from now. And I would not know I came from the past. The same going backwards. If I travel back to when I was 5 years old, if I truly travel in time in a consistent, internally consistent manner, then I will only have the memories I had when I was a 5-year-old, and I would not know I traveled in time. So what I'm trying to say to you is that if the culture would portray time in an internally consistent manner, we may all be existing in eternity right now. We may be occupying all the points in time. And at any one of those points, we would have the memories and the cognitive context consistent with that point in time. And we would think, well, we are in this point in time and not in any other. You see what I mean? But sci-fi...
Bernardo, also, we need to consider that when you talk about memory, you're implicit in the idea of memory, there is time, right? So it's the idea that you can store in time an experience. But of course, you cannot store an experience because you can only store pointers to an experience, because the experience, being quantum, continuously changes. That is a continuing dynamism, is a vector in Hilbert space that rotates in ways, in n dimensions that are near infinite, so you don't have, in quantum, you cannot have memory of a quantum state, because to have a memory of quantum state, you have to copy the quantum state, and you cannot copy the quantum state. You see?
Yeah, you're rigorously correct. My simplification was the following: whatever memories, whatever these experience will call memories might be, let's call it a set of states that exists in a point in time. So if you self-consistently apply the concept of time travel, if you go back in time, that means you would land in a place where you would have the set of states that belong in that point in time. And therefore, you would not know that you traveled in time. It would seem to you like you were just traversing the arrow of time normally. So the thought exercise is that if we are really rigorous about how we conceptualize time travel, the implication is that we are all living in eternity. Or at least the implication is that we cannot refute the possibility that we are all living in all points in time right now.
I'm not arguing with what you said. I'm simply pointing out that even when you bring in the concept of memory, you bring another dimension of time, you so to speak,
Mhm.
that needs to be recognized, that you're still talking of time when you're talking about memory. And so,
Yeah, that's true.
it makes the old structure of the discourse much more complex, because you use memory as if it was a given, and having nothing to do with time, but it does. And so what you see is reentrant.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it's difficult.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great question.
I
Pablo.
struggle for it for the last, I would say, the last 5 years. I've been thinking about, on and off, about the nature of time, and as a fundamental question that needs to be answered. So I've tried all kinds of ways, but as I said, I haven't even landed on a plausible conjecture. I don't even have that, because every time I think I have landed in a plausible conjecture, the next day I destroy it.
Thank you, Pablo. Great question to end on, and especially since we've run out of time, and just wanting to say, Federico, again, just deep gratitude. There's still so many questions in the chat. We maybe got through 10% of them. So I just hope this was interesting and fun enough for you to maybe consider doing something similar, either with us or another platform in the future. I can tell as well that it's been really engaging for everyone, this opportunity to dialogue with you and hear from you directly, especially together with Bernardo. I'm just wondering if there's any collaborations either or both of you would like us to know about, or some closing remarks you'd like to offer to us or each other as we close the evening.
Yeah, I take it as part of my mission in life right now to help promote Federico's ideas going forward the best way I can. Federico is translating his latest book, and hope I have the honor of being in a position where I can try to promote that. So yeah, that's you could call it a collaboration, or whatever Federico produces, I'll be right behind trying to amplify that as much as I can.
Well, Bernardo, you're almost embarrassing me, because frankly, I mean, come on. I mean, I admire you immensely, and you are much more pointed logically than I am, because I'm more of an intuitive guy, and I sort of reflect more on my experience than a reasoning over my experience. And so I think that the collaboration here is powerful, because you can even explain better than I can through, in other words, the combination of the two is almost like, getting closer to allowing people to recognize and, what we are saying within themselves through two different points of view that are not orthogonal, but they're not parallel lines. They're not the same point of view. One is more intuitive, imaginative, and the other one is more rigorous, more logic, and you need both. That's really why science and spirituality must come together, because science brings exactly that rigor, the logical rigor, that rationality into it, that people that do spirituality generally don't apply. And so you can go everywhere, you don't maintain a coherence in a structure which is there. That there is a structure in your experience. It is what meaning is ultimately, is a structure, but is a structure that is infinite, and you can never bring out completely. You can only bring out little by little, more and more, ever more complex. And of course, in all structure that you can bring out, they are connected, because everything is connected. So, and that's why, for example, mathematical theories are connected. Where theorems in a certain set of axioms, find connection with another math that is completely different, different kind of set of axioms, and you find that to explain something new, you need to go there. So this connection also of math is telling you that mathematics we do the reductionistic game with mathematics also, and then we create different, different theories, but they're all connected from the inside. So when we do the simplest thing that we do all the time, which is a limit to infinity within a theory, we have violated the principle of holism, because if everything is connected, okay, somehow in some later time you have to encounter a connection with something else that you now have excluded in your limit to infinity, because you're living within a specific one single theory, which is limited. You see.
Go ahead.
I'm losing.
No, okay. I didn't mean to embarrass you, Federico, and just to give context, because people here probably never saw me being reverential towards somebody else, and I have enough self-awareness that I know I'm reverential towards you. So I just wanted to give an account of that.
It's called the age, right?
Well, not only that. The things we can do, the things I can do, I take for granted. And what I admire is the things I can't do. You see what I mean? So yeah. the grass is always greener at the neighbors, right? So I know that you had the same original educational background I had. And although being the same as me in that regard, you can do a whole bunch of things that I cannot do. And yes, maybe I can do some other things that you think you cannot do, but the grass is always greener at the neighbors. So what I can do, I take for granted, and I find it extraordinary that you've been in the places of the mind where you have been. And the other one is the Z80 and the 4000 and 4004. So for people to understand this, I was a kid and like 7 years old, and I got a ZX81, which is a very old computer from Britain that was released in 1981. And the first thing I did, because that's who I was as a kid, I crack it open. There are only 4 screws in a ZX81. And I look at it, and there are 4 chips in it. And the big one, my father points at it and says, "This is the Z80. And it was created by Mr. Faggin." So, my father said, "This is the computer's brain," which it's a bad metaphor, but I didn't know it back then. "This is the brain of the computer, and it was created by Mr. Faggin." I don't know how he knew that. He subscribed to all kinds of electronics magazines, Popular Electronics. Something appeared in one of the magazines, and he knew your name. So when I was 7 years old, instantly, Federico Faggin became a god. If you know what I mean. And it's very difficult to overcome that as you grow up. Your first hero remains your first hero. And that I'm here today with him is mind-boggling to me. The child in me, it's like having a seizure.
Thank you, Bernardo. You see, that emotions have a lot to do with who we are.
You bet.
I'm not wanting to pile on any embarrassment, but in the chat, there's many people saying this is a wonderful evening, very special. Bernardo and Federico are quantum entanglement. And I say this almost every time we've done a few courses now with Bernardo, and Bernardo always insists that he isn't a spiritual teacher, but I just find something in my experience opens up during these hours together and in the following days and weeks. And certainly I've had the same experience with you, Federico. Even though I have no scientific background, as I've said several times, just in listening to you, I felt something in the heart opening up, and I really hope others feel the same way, that they can take something from this that brings more wonder and curiosity and kindness into their lives. And I hope our paths cross again. It's been very, very special.
Thank you.
For me too, it's been very special for me.